everyone for coming to today's Lunchbox series seminar. We've got Janice McRandal, Dr. Janice McRandal, talking to us today about some of the research that she's been doing in the space relating to theology and masculinity. And today she's going to specifically be talking about how that fits within the space of the Rio Olympics for 2016. Thanks, Janice.
Thank you very welcome. I was glad, I think, when Lyndall asked if I would have some time for one of the Lunchbox series to talk about my research at the moment. So for those of you who don't know, on January 1st I will enter into 6-month study leave to work on a book project. So, okay. Go with it. Oh, it's the thing. Yeah, so come January 1st I'll be having 6 months to work on a book that I have started working on over the last 12 months and doing some research towards. So I'm going to share a bit with you about that book and then some of the individual chapters in relation to the Rio Olympics. Hopefully that's interesting for you. But please interrupt or, I don't know if you have any discussion points at any time. If I won't talk too long. I have a PowerPoint, so that makes me feel terribly prepared. Well done to me. This isn't working. Thank you. So one of the basic assumptions for my book is that sport has become a domain for significant expression of our religious imagination and religious impulse in the contemporary world. You know, a lot of people, a lot of faithful Christians or religious folk of a different kind of world religion feel terribly upset sometimes in the religious nature of people's sporting commitments, and that you know, people are more committed to their sports team than their local church. My assumption is value neutral around this. Whether it's good or bad is not something that I'm examining or like contesting Jesus with sporting figures, but rather to say, well, what does that, like a mirror, reveal back to us about where we are with our religious imagination, and in particular of reading doctrine, the kind of classical doctrinal concerns that we've had in the West, in the Christian church. How would I read doctrine through the lens of various sports? So that's what my project is. It's a bit weird and funky, and I was very surprised that the publisher wanted me to publish it and offered me a book contract. So hooray, we'll see if they're as enthusiastic when I turn something in, but this is what it's going to look like. This is the working title. I don't like it that much, so if you have any other suggestions, that's their suggestion: The Body's Grace, Sport and Theology in Motion. And there'll be 7 chapters, an introduction kind of outlaying the reality of religion in sport and the way it animates a lot of our religious ideas and religious performances. And then I'm going to look at 5 doctrinal areas in particular. So as a systematic theologian, that's kind of normal for me to do, look at doctrine, but it's a bit unusual to do it this way. So the first chapter will be on dances, and particularly ballet dance as a theology of time. So thinking about some of the classical questions of how we approach the question of time and eternity through ballet. The second chapter will be about women's rugby and theologies of liturgy, and how it is that we think about liturgy as something that forms Christian identity or not. And I'll be looking at women's rugby in particular as a kind of generative, constructive way of reimagining that, and I'll talk a bit about that a little later on. Then ball games and masculinity, pun intended, and the theology of the atonement. So I'll be looking at the doctrine of the atonement primarily through ball sports, big-time ball sports, and again we'll talk a bit more about that today in relation to the Rio Olympics, but how a theology of atonement can be worked out in reference to masculinity. And I presented a paper earlier this year on that at the ANZAC conference in Melbourne. I know some of you were there, so I don't bore you. And then I'm going to do a Christology on Serena Williams. So that's where it gets especially weird at this point in the book. Serena Williams will be the Christological kind of pseudo-figure. I'm not saying she's Christ. If you want to, I'm not saying she's Christ, but I'll be looking at Serena Williams and a Christology of non-identity. So a kind of Christology that incorporates questions of identity politics, if you're familiar with that kind of discourse, but is always giving way to a non-identity. Then I'm doing, which I think I'm most excited about, is the 6th chapter, is my eschatology will be about watching test match cricket. So none of this one day business, or in 2020, but about watching, I don't know who's sat, has anyone sat at the ground and watched a whole test match before?
At the ground.
At the ground?
I
I have, and it will be really reflecting on this kind of experience, and a theology of hope, which sort of reframes the kind of doctrinal eschatology away from the future and into the present, patience for patience' sake.
Did the test match go for the full 5 days?
It did. I've been to several for a full 5 days, and many Sheffield Shield matches for the full 4 days. So, cricket tragic from the mid-90s. Not many friends when you want to go every day, but
Is that going to be a very long chapter?
You have to be patient now. So that's the general idea of the book, and I mean the question of motion and thinking theology as motion is kind of the thing that's hanging it all together at this point, but we'll see. I've probably done some significant work towards the introduction in 2 of the chapters, and then with much thanks to the church and Trinity College, Queensland, I'll enter into my study leave and get it all done in no time. So that's what I'm working towards. Okay, so I'm going to have a look at 2 of those chapters, the ball games of masculinity and women's rugby, and in reference to the Rio Olympics. So I'm not making any reference, obviously, to the Paralympics that have just started. I haven't thought that far ahead yet. So, yeah. So the first thing is this idea of masculine atonement through ball sports. In this chapter, some of the ideas I'm working with is that ball sports, big-time ball sports, and if you think of rugby, but of course in America, NFL, soccer, baseball, these kind of domains that really have economies larger than more than half the world's nations. These single sports, these massive big-time ball sports, work harder than any other to construct monolithic and stable dogmas. So they're the most professionalised, recognised, celebrated and rewarded domains of exclusive masculinity. There are very few sports where women's participation comes even close in recognition across the different levels to men. Tennis would be, but it's only very occasionally and even not consistently. But in the case of ball sports, as I said, these are economies that are bigger than most countries. If you think of our Pacific neighbours, for example, this is just like the main arena of masculine power, and a side of a really kind of stable dogma of what it means to be a man exists across these ball sports. Interestingly, these are sports also that if you ever pick up a book on sport and theology, nearly always they focus on, funnily enough, they're written by men, and nearly always they focus on ball sports. It's as if a woman playing a different sport had never even occurred to them, and there might be a little chapter at the end about women or the question of gender, but they're really always thinking these sports as the norm of sports. So that creates kind of an interesting way to look at issues of masculinity. If this is the dominant arena, the coliseum of what it means to be a real man, or what we want it to be a real man, or what we're trying to say about masculinity. These are the sports that have always been about reconciling man with masculinity. So if you know much about the history of muscular Christianity, this is where ball sports actually got, in some cases, invented, but also formalised. So rugby union and rugby league in the UK come out of Christian theological explanations of masculinity. In America, a lot of the literature would say the invention of baseball, setting up rules for basketball. It's all related to the church and this fear of feminization. So these major ball sports were, from the very beginning of their organised form, about preserving a kind of masculinity. So it's woven into their very DNA to do this job, to affect this. And these are the sports, I'm arguing, where mechanisms of atonement become most pervasive in the layers of performative reenactment. In the way the sports are performed, the impulse for an atoning kind of masculinity is most evident. Now I'm going to unpack that a bit, some of the ways that I'm reading that. So the first is evident in the holy call to long suffering and self-sacrifice for sportsmen. Some of the behaviour on the sporting field that we cheer and we applaud and we think is like wonderfully heroic would be completely ridiculous and stupid and moronic in any other realm. But when it happens on the sporting field, we think these long-suffering, sacrificial men are heroes. So it glorifies them and it kind of opens up this place for those predestined few that are chosen for this kind of refining balance. Secondly, precisely when there are concerns about waning masculinity, i.e. the rise of muscular Christianity, we actually invent and create sports that weaponize the body and emphatically emphasize the salvific action of violent sacrifice. So if you think of the ancient Colosseum, for example, people in large, for the most part, have weapons. Right at that moment where we're worried about men's bodies not being masculine enough, the man's body itself becomes the weapon on the sporting field. I no longer have a weapon that I will enter into contest with. I have a body, and we will beat each other violently to prove ourselves somehow. The whole idea of saviours in teams and for the fans, the whole God-forsaken city, we're reminded once again to cast our eyes upon the proper side of worship, the victorious male body, the body that has conquered through suffering and sacrifice. So the whole kind of worshipping performance of the Saviour is enacted through the fandom and through the performance of those in the Colosseum. And then I've made the point down here, obviously this is a complicated reconciliation, but big time ball sports are mobile and quick in order to mutate multiple forms of this atoning work. So the fallen white sportsman, and this is where I'm going to move to making some links to the Rio Olympics, the white man who disgraces himself and scandalously reveals his impurity. I'm sure maybe you can think of one or two ball sport stars that might have done something I don't know, is that a bit far stretch? Some might come to mind. They can always have an opportunity to play both the role of saviour and the saved. They can always make their way back if they secure some next big victory. Or, sporting success covers a multitude of sins, right? For the white man. And it's interesting, there's lots of research done this, particularly in America, about media reporting on when a black football player is involved in a scandal versus a white football player. The whole tone is completely separate discourses, and this is a big area of study. So the white man in ball sports can really, in some ways, it can actually be the impetus for the atoning performance. If they could just get themselves involved in a big enough scandal and come back from it, they can reach higher heights than they ever have before. But this is not available to black athletes in sports. They're already kind of tarnished by their blackness, but it's not a pathway generally for the black man. So sport provides for masculinity its own but very familiar soteriology. The link I want to make, which was interesting to me at the Rio Olympics, does anyone know where I'm heading with this? It's not a ball sports, but it's certainly a white male saviour, saved saviour, is Michael Phelps. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story of Phelps in 2014. He was arrested for drink driving. He had a significant amount of drugs in his possession. He was the great shame of the nation, and I don't know if you watched much of the swimming at the Olympics, but somehow, and he's the whole 30 years old, so he's very, very old now. He's come back.
Same age as the Saviour, though.
He's the same. So the whole story makes way for this. And this is a quote from one of the commentators. He's been through some very tough times, and you could just imagine the language. If that's what Chris Gale, the cricket player, for a lot of us, he's written off forever now. He probably can't make his way back ever. But Michael Phelps, golden white boy, he's been through some tough times. But, anyone in my class is with about my topic? Yeah, thanks. But there is no doubt that he leaves these Olympics bathed in glory. He hasn't just made a comeback, it's all this kind of theological language. He's bathed in glory. He's taken on the cloak of the Messiah. He's not only saved, he is the saviour figure. And we worship him, you know, we gather around and worship him.
That's also the nature of swimming, though. Because within the 4-year cycle, swimmers are not known.
No, that's true. Yeah, they enter into this period of...
If you go back to your theory on ball sports, they are 24/7, 365 days a year. Whereas swimmers, and this is why Phelps actually managed to recover from that, was it happened right in the depth of this 4-year cycle.
Right. I mean, if you think of, I'm sure you can think of some white sporting stars, some Australian sporting stars that have come back. I mean, and like in the 1990s, the kind of scandals that rugby league players were involved in. I don't know if you remember the story of Brad Fittler, who tried to have sex with a Christmas tree. That's not even apocryphal. He tried to have sex with a Christmas tree, the Australian rugby league captain, but his next big game is great, and like sporting success covers a multitude of sins. So it's a repetition in sport and a kind of masculinity that's secured through these kind of victories. So that's what I'll be doing primarily in this chapter. Does anyone want to say anything about that? Or?
I think there's some very interesting parallels with war when war was a masculine pastime.
Yeah.
It's almost like, in the same way as you might say, well, this person is a good soldier but a bad man, but we need good soldiers.
Yeah.
We say we almost imply we need good sportsmen because we need them, we're prepared to forgive them for these
Well, that's really interesting, because one of the concerns in muscular Christianity was the lack of war. We're not sending young boys out to war. How do we make them into proper men?
Yeah.
They need to be violent. They need to know how to win a contest. We'll organise sport. So there is a direct link there in the history.
I
of
also
that.
think that there was some fantastic ironies here for my generation, for whom the geeks identified themselves against the jocks, went away and said we're not like them.
Yeah.
And now, one generation later, there's a problem in geek culture with toxic masculinity, and they've constructed incredibly violent competitive video games through which the same things are constructed. It's
That's
just about
fascinating,
mind and dexterity rather than about the masculine body.
No, it's really interesting. There's one theory that people work with is like the way sport has mutated in the last 50, 60 years. If you think of big time ball sports across the board, but particularly in rugby, and it's now going that in NFL, but it's going that way with rugby in Australia. A much higher black, or in rugby Pacific Islander population taking over the game, higher skilled. A lot of theorists would read that it's exactly the same thing reperforming itself, only now the white respectable men who have office jobs sit back and vicariously secure their own white superior masculinity by saying, I'm not like that brutish black guy that's going to spend all his money at wherever and carry on like a fool. So there's the same performance like mutating in
I also wonder if there's the more these ideals of masculinity rise above the ability of ordinary people to achieve them, the more vicariousness there is.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm a fan and I achieve salvation when my team
It needs to be
wins.
secured for me.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and all based on this idea that there's an ideal of masculinity, as long as we're chasing after that.
I always think of the cricketer Eddie Gilbert at times like this, who got Bradman out for a duck. I forget where that went. And he would have probably been celebrated, except that he was Aboriginal.
Yes.
And he never played another game after getting Bradman out for a duck in a Sheffield Shield match. And then he went on to become an alcoholic, develop syphilis, and die in Orson Park Hospital, whose grave's there now.
Yes.
But he, in a sense, was the scapegoat for the great white saviour of Don Bradman.
Yes.
He actually, was the devil attacking him and then paying the price.
Yes.
Had he been white, it would have been a very different story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to see how your theory plays out with regards to the comparison between Leighton Hewitt and Nick Kyrgios.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Leighton Hewitt is an example of a person who redeemed himself. He was a rat bag.
Yeah.
Many people
Yeah.
thought he couldn't come back, but he's
Yeah.
the captain of the Davis Cup team. Nick Kyrgios is in the middle of which way will he go?
Being a brat.
Can he be given a
Yeah.
chance?
Yeah.
But then there's so this is the question I have is, so Tiger Woods,
Yeah.
he's failed, I think, to come back. But
Yeah.
then that's confounded with the fact that he's never returned to form
Yeah.
that he had prior to that
Yeah.
scandal. And so I wonder, that makes me wonder, so is this really us bringing an atonement sort of theology or the semantics of that whole theology to rebirth these men into people that we admire, or does it reflect that actually we're shallow enough in our society that we're happy just to attend to one aspect of Phelps' humanity, and that is he can swim fast,
Yeah.
and so because that would then explain why Tiger Woods is still on the radar.
Yeah.
And questions of morality don't come into it because we don't have the depth of conversation in our society or discussion around those sort of things to be able to attend to that aspect of humanity. So I'm wondering, could it be explained in another way that we're just a shallow society, just happy to see Brad Pittler get up and play another game?
Well, the kind of the social research into that would say, but we only are shallow and don't want to have that conversation when it's white men. If it's a black man involved in a sex scandal, we'll talk about it at great length.
No,
If it's a
that's all right.
woman, God forbid, that did something sexually questionable or notorious, then that will all she'll ever be known for. So, and yes, Peter.
I think it's also instructive to look at what happens when women try and enter into these masculine areas.
We're about to look at that.
Okay. I'll talk about Jackie Mitchell later.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
a very interesting case.
Yeah.
But
So,
going on Lee's point, George Best.
Oh, yeah.
I spent most of my money on whiskey and women, and the rest I wasted.
yeah.
This is my
Those of
famous
you who
quote.
don't know, the famous Irish soccer player,
Football.
player, and terrible notorious alcoholic. He drank himself to death, didn't he? Or-
He had 3 liver transplants. He had a drug that he put in his stomach that as soon as he had any form of alcohol, he actually vomited. That was how serious his cirrhosis of the liver was.
Yeah.
I don't think it was actually alcoholism that killed him in the end,
But yeah,
but it was.
notorious for this kind of behaviour.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it was also his saving grace was that he was part of the Busby Babes,
Yeah.
and he could. It didn't matter what he did.
Yeah.
Time after time, he would come back, and it was that he's that classic white
Yeah.
man who is allowed to redeem himself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'll move on. How are we doing for time? Okay, good. Yeah, so the next thing I wanted to look at then is women's rugby and liturgy, because like one of my working assumptions here is this is almost in the case of women's rugby, it's almost impossible to nail down the kind of stable identity markers that you find in big time ball sports. It would be very interesting. I've been following women's rugby for some years, but now that it was just at the Olympics, a lot of Australia suddenly followed women's rugby and they won the gold medal. It would be very interesting to see how this happens, because the more public interest there is in any sport, the more money, i.e. money, the more hands of power that are involved in any sport, the more monotone they become, the more they are narrowed into, definite kinds of this is what it means to be a part of this. So you see much more kind of creative, rule-defying playfulness in sports that nobody cares about. And women's rugby is a really great example of this. If you think about women's rugby, I'm not going to ask you, but a lot of people when I've had this conversation, particularly over the last 20 years as it's built up interest, a lot of people very instantly thought of very, very large, hairy, butch women. That's the kind of image that would come to mind, that the women who play rugby, it's all lesbians out there on the field, and that it's a kind of a dyke community. And there's certainly elements of that which have been subversive and liberating for various women in what you might call butch community, but if you've watched, did anyone watch some of the women's rugby games? It doesn't look like what a lot of people think it's going to look like, and the kind of people you meet that tell you, and it's happened here recently, Kathleen played a bit of women's rugby, our new executive assistant, the kind of women that you meet, it's just such a broad palette of different women and their experiences. They nearly always say about how liberating and strangely liberating this experience was for them. So I'm relating it to liturgy, the theology of liturgy. Liturgy and patriarchal deformation. So I'm thinking about gendered liturgical forms in our church. 50, 60 years ago, when women were excluded from a lot of the things that happen in the life of the church, things weren't so gendered. So on one hand, we see progress in women's involvement. On the other, we see these kind of gendered mechanisms to norm women and into an ideal kind of femininity. So now we have things like women's Bibles. I have no idea why there is such a thing as a women's Bible, apart from capitalism, or turning women into an ideal kind of feminine.
Yeah.
But there's a men's Bible, a youth Bible.
Yeah, and both. So why do we need to police a gendered form of reading the Bible? And actually you'll see often the women and men's Bibles, they'll have a devotional. You go and see which text they're reflecting on. They're different. They're not just generic Bibles, they're norming and forming people into ideal women and ideal men. So we have women's Bibles with flowers on the front, worship music that sometimes caters to women's vestments, women's preaching styles, and ultimately an entire liturgical order for women to participate in the church. So I want to say that I think that's bad. I think that this is like a bad thing in the way that ball sports might create ideal masculinities that are often toxic and oppressive, so might the gendered ordering of liturgy in the church. And that they fashion the same kind of thing, a white middle class, white hot mum, or MILF if you like, as the included woman in the church. We welcomed women into the church, but this is the kind of woman we really want. This kind of middle class, attractive suburban mummy who picks the kids up after soccer and etc. And I'm then throwing around the idea of sport as a site of resistance. So when I said at the beginning, for me sport is neither good nor bad, it just is. I'm not reading sport as it's just a location of oppression and bad things in society. Just as much as it is that, it's also a location of creativeness and playfulness and subversion and the kind of resistant communities that build up. It's both of those things. So in this case, I'm reading women's rugby through a very kind of creative, playful lens. So, a number of the points, and I mean, here is I'll get to that, but a number of the points that I'll be drawing out of this is that the movement repertoire in women's rugby is actually quite different. It's actually a different way for women to move. There's a very famous study in the 1970s that, and this was a flawed kind of diagnostic tool, but a very famous study that tested women's movement capacity, and there were ways that women didn't even know they could use their body in comparison to men, like the way an arm might be used, because women's movement were limited to a particular domestic realms, and they didn't use their body in the way men would in the kind of sports and activities that men were involved in. So if you remember in the early 20th century, it was a great controversy for women to move from side saddle to sort of wrap their legs around a horse. So if you think a movement like that was such a radical kind of political idea, the way women use their bodies has changed and evolved over time. So the repertoire of body movements in rugby, where a woman squats and gets low and drops a shoulder to go into a scrum or to tackle somebody, it enlarges the kind of movement repertoire that's been acceptable for women and the ideal feminine. Also the limitation of norms that is found in women's rugby. So recent research has obviously consistently exposed these assumptions about butch, lesbian and not real women of rugby. And I love this picture because you have a woman with, they're my life goals, the thighs of the Australian women's rugby team, with great strong thighs and big strong shoulders, and she has pigtails. It's none of the cliches are present. The cliches we're looking for, there's just a multiplicity of images of different women participating. So sometimes you will see a picture of a woman on the rugby field that looks like the cliche butch woman, but you'll also see very feminine, typical kind of hairstyles and different body shapes. So none of these norms are played out in women's rugby. It seems, because of the lack of interest and the lack of money, that these women have been able to kind of be who they are in more creative ways. Did anyone see this proposal that happened this is a woman in the Brazilian rugby team, and her girlfriend came and proposed to her. So there's all these different kinds of images happening and being performed in the movement of women's rugby. And then like the final point of this chapter is thinking about these bodies then, because a lot of people, this quote I'm using about the symbolic annihilation of the ideal feminine in women's rugby, it's symbolically annihilated because of the sheer multiplicity of images in women's rugby. That's a quote from somebody else. Is thinking then about apophatic bodies, an apophatic negation that can negate what norms the body through the ambiguity of these bodies' movements. So I'm thinking liturgy. Liturgy is movement, and the movement of these bodies in rugby. And there's a quote here that might bring it all together. I realised that I was putting this together. Those of you who were at worship this morning might be able to tell that Peter and I wrote this a long time ago to talk about a lot of things. Liturgy too is a movement beyond text, beyond both worldview and formation into fixed identity and narrative. When we realise it's a movement, our anxious attempts to enforce the formation of discursive subjects are exposed laden with ideologies of norming narratives and teleologies. And like women's rugby, this is liturgy's redemptive possibility of formation. The possibility of the self coming into an existence, a self only because it is coming into an existence, because it is a body in movement. So it's a kind of existential, liturgical theology that's thinking about movement and not the static kind of fixed identities of formation. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm doing there. How are we going for time now?
Nearly 10 past.
Okay.
10 past.
Alright, so just one very quick last thing. This is not from the book, but this is more a reflection on the Rio 2016 Olympics and some pictures to show you. Is one of the things that disturbed me, I don't know if it disturbed you, is, and the Australian press, likewise the English press, is famous for this, is for our complete disgust and disappointment in our Olympic team. And then, did you see many headlines? These are some headlines. There's a graph that shows you the decline in our medal tally since the 2000 Olympics, and these are some of the headlines that were happening during the able-bodied Olympics. So Australia's horror show, Australia's disastrous Olympic campaign. Is it worth the money that we spent? You know, when they do this tally of medals for dollars and this kind of thing. The disappointment, I looked at it, the definite article is very clear, is palpable. And do you want to fix Australian swimming? Like, it's clearly broken. There's this sense of failure, like these poor Olympians that have, you know, I think it was, I've forgotten the lady's name, she's from Brisbane, who won a gold medal in the rowing. And in her interview after she won, she just expressed how sad she was that the country was so disappointed in its Olympic athletes. So even over there, in the moment of winning gold, she still had this sense of, like, I'm sorry that Australia's so disappointed in us. We've really done our best. And it just had me thinking about how we think about sport and the contest of sport and winning and losing, and also about failure, how we think about that theologically. There's a great book, this book, Judith Holstrom, The Queer Art of Failure, and in it he uses a number of images that were taken, I don't know if anyone saw these at the Sydney 2000 Olympics, by Tracy Moffat, an Australian-American photographer, and she only took photos of the fourth place getters at the Sydney Olympics. And so this is an exposition into how do we think creatively about failure, and I've used this in various theology classes to think, what does for Christians especially, who worship a man who was crucified on a cross, essentially a political failure in some terms, how do we think theologically about failure? And then if sport has this kind of religious imaginary, how do we think about the context of sport in that way? So this is one of all the images are coming up from Tracy Moffat. I think they're mostly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, from from this series, and it was called Force, if you want to look it up, Force. And they're really remarkable photos. And so obviously you can see the editing process, the colour is kept on the full space scale. And sometimes devastation, sometimes confusion, sometimes bewilderment. So this is a quote about queer failure. It's a narrative about anti-colonial struggle, the refusal of legibility and an art of unbecoming. And you think about that kind of apathetic theology that I'm drawing on, this idea of moving away from these fixed identities and narratives. This is a story of art without markets, drama without a script, narrative without progress. The queer art of failure turns on the impossible, the improbable, the unlikely, and the unremarkable. It quietly loses. And in losing, it imagines other goals for life, for love, for art, for being. But like if I can't think the gospel through those terms, I feel like I've missed something. So some of the ideas that draws out, that's Patria Thomas, do you remember her? Yeah, is that failure can serve as a critique of the complex oppressions, the kind of things we've been talking about, gender norming and deforming, and also critically for him is capitalism, the way capitalism kind of operates through the ideas of success and winning and being on top. So weapons of the weak. Actually, those who failed and already been on the outside know how to do this very well. So it could be turned on its head as an opportunity, the weapons of the weak. Rejecting pragmatism, social norms, the kind of aesthetics, queer aesthetics of failure representing opportunities for creative living. Like here, it's not a dead end. Here's a way to flip the whole world order upside down and think of new ways of living in the world. And enlarging the canon of productive creative forms of existence. So things like fatigue and indifference and boredom, ironic distancing, all sorts of things that aren't generally considered productive forms of emotional experience or any kind of experience becoming new ways of thinking how to live. Added that in again. Or am I going back? Oh. Or just
No, go forward.
okay. So I'm not going to say any more on that, but here's another quote from Tracy Moffat. Just let you read that. And that's all I've got to say.
I was thinking throughout about the so-called drug cheats as people who try to take shortcuts to the ideal masculinity, for example, but also commit what may be the unforgivable sin or almost the unforgivable sin in doing it.
Grieving the Holy Spirit?
But it's certainly, I mean, there's a huge political dimension in it, of course, but I was just wondering if drug cheating comes anywhere into your thinking about this.
Yeah, there are, like the whole idea of performance enhancement is a question in like sports theory, because where do we draw the lines? For instance, if you remember thinking in the swimming world, the swimming suits that have now since been banned because they were too performance enhancing.
Yep.
So the various kind of technologies, the question of Oscar Pistorius, which is a really complex and delicate question about ability and the use of performance enhancement and or technologies in sports. they seem like fairly complex philosophical questions to me. I've read a bit about it. I'm not sure how and where it will make something into my own research, but it does seem like the easy answer is there, jug cheats, and then there's everyone else. Seems fairly unnuanced to me.
But within the drug cheats, there's also a very big methodology behind it.
The science of managing cheating?
Not just, but also that there's, as an example, weightlifters are told, don't be in the country this month.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
And they're told when they're not allowed to be in the country
Yeah.
because they know that Asada is going to be there. That's the month they've
Yeah.
got to nominate where they're going to be, and they just forget to tell them until a couple of weeks
Yeah.
later, and then they go off with the rabbi.
Yeah.
That's why they should let everyone.
I don't think
Sorry?
that, although
They should
actually,
let everyone do it.
I mean, that is
That's
interesting
just
where the hard and
cycle.
fast lines are drawn. There's no way, like Lance Armstrong's done. I don't think, he's already had his moment, his comeback after testicular cancer. Not that that was atoning, but he's had his, so it is interesting where the lines are drawn. I don't think there's any way, and even the way people have critiqued his lack of contrition. If he hasn't come out and publicly allowed himself to be shamed, then there's no way back for him.
Well, that's
But that goes back to what we said.
Stories. Is he redeemable? If he gets out of jail and...
I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah, and there's another. I mean, there's, in terms of the race question and even sexuality, one of the you often see essays about is Magic Johnson and the case of HIV, but there's always this very strong link to his, because when he comes out, one essay I read actually, because this is where sexuality comes into it, was comparing Magic Johnson and Greg Louganis. Do you remember Greg Louganis, the Olympic diver, perhaps the best diver the world had ever seen, had cracked his head in the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, then came back and won the gold medal, and then years later it was revealed that he was HIV positive and his blood had got, now of course nobody, like he would have had to have been there at the exact moment and drank it. Like it's just impossible. But at the height of the AIDS fear epidemic, he can't be redeemed because he's a gay man with gay panic. But somehow Magic Johnson was very brave in coming forward and announcing. So the kind of race and sexuality dynamics there are very, very interesting. It makes it sound like they're objectified playthings, but the kind of complex questions there. And Magic Johnson, in some way, seems brave, but in another way, he's still essentially irredeemable.
The fellow who came second behind Usain Bolt in the 100 metres, but an American runner who'd at a certain time not been excluded for a while. The commentators were very ambivalent about the chances of him winning.
Was it Ben Johnson?
Ben Johnson.
They were asking each other, what if Ben Johnson wins?
So I actually
there
think
would have been a sense of
use of
outrage.
drugs is one of those lines,
Mm.
a hard and fast line. That's why they can't
I
come
don't
back.
think it is any longer.
No,
Yeah.
Australia
Because
won't be.
12 years ago, 20 years ago, if you were caught with drugs, you were right for 4 years.
Oh, I
It
don't
was
think
like
by
for-
official.
It was like for an Olympic cycle.
I
Then
mean by
peer
the public.
pressure has reduced that 92 years.
Yeah.
So that whole thing of drugs is not our need for you to win that gold medal is more important than anything,
But
any
I
crime
don't
that
think
you
you'll
can
ever
commit.
win, like I can't think of an example of someone that just slotted back into the public favour. The officials and regulations might be changing, but I don't think, someone like Ben Johnson's wife, Marion Jones, same thing, like just cannot come back into the, Flojo was my favourite when I was a
The
kid.
thing on it though is the discussion that you're having is all about people who have not come back. That their drug use has all been found out after they're finished.
Yep.
And it's the same reason why Pretorius will never be redeemable within that context. Because by the time he gets out, he will not be able to get back to that level
that's true.
to redeem himself.
Somebody feel like that Chinese swimmer who, yeah, the Australian media had a field day with this story. Drug cheat, he only got 3 months. Like, this was very clear that this is a case of you will never ever, regardless of what the, and everyone thinks
But
it's
then-
even wrong.
But if
But
I
that had been caught taking drugs and then tried to do a comeback. I think the mood was that if he had been successful, he would have been fully redeemed.
An Australian swimmer.
Yeah, I can't remember.
But you also have to look at, and I find this is a really interesting dynamic within the sports context. If Australia goes and dominates in the pool, it is because they've got such wonderful coaches and they've trained them so well. If China goes and does exactly the same thing, it's because they're all on drugs. There is no ifs or buts about it.
I think there's some interesting power dynamics going on within drug taking, though, that we always blame individual athletes when it's only just very recently when the whole Russian track and field team got banned that we start asking questions about pressures on it to succeed on a team level and whether or not there's something wrong there.
Look, I don't remember East Germany because I was too young, but I bet there was probably was there feeling that something's going on in East Germany?
Yes.
Suspicion? Yeah. So I think, but I do think one of the interesting things is how money plays into the whole question of what drug cheating is. So there are access in various countries to using the kind of banned substances that are performance enhancing. We've pumped millions of dollars into new research for performance enhancement by the rules that those countries could never ever have access to. So I think it's kind of the way this is wrapped up in the power centres of capitalism can't be lost from the debate.
And of course in the 80s we had all the, when Russia kept winning, it was asked because those people have XXY.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So,
Janice, I'm really interested in gender issues in football. And are you going to do any exploration of extra football activities such as cheerleaders or footy show?
Raping or curricular activities.
Isn't
that what it means to be female?
Yeah, all the books about, particularly, there's a lot more in about American football, about this, about the whole construction of, not only do we create the ideal masculine, but we create the ideal feminine and we put her on the sideline and we have her parade.
Worshipping the male players.
Yeah, so, cheerleading, for example, American cheerleading, first originated in Princeton and Yale, and it was men. Men were cheerleaders. It wasn't women doing it. So this is the kind of, it morphed into women's participation. I actually think the situation is worse in places like Australia. At least there's this level of acrobatic sporting programs of cheerleaders in America, which is male and female. Here
Less clothes, the better.
Exotic dancing on the sideline. So, I don't know if you know the feminist gender theorist at Sydney University who's been working with the NRL for the last 20 years, since the mid-90s, doing basic coaching of NRL players like, that thing that's illegal, raping women, you shouldn't do it. They have to take these courses. And this has always, perplexed me that they're putting the players through these courses and and then things like the footy show exist, and then they run out on the field, and who do they run past? And the whole production, what's the point of telling these men not to treat women like objects when every sign and symbol around them tells them that women are objects? So, something like rugby, I love rugby, I watched it so religiously as a teenager. I can't watch it now, I just can no longer, it seems an irritatingly sexist
whatever that
culture.
bash cricket thing, and I like sport.
Yes.
Sports person all my life. And I cannot watch it purely because of the dance that breaks out after every sixth is hit, which is so ridiculously revolting.
Some years ago, Russell Crowe bought the South Sydney Rabbitohs club, and he got rid of the cheerleaders, and it was seen as a very bad financial move. And he brought in a marching band, so they don't have cheerleaders at South Sydney anymore, they have a marching band, because he just thought this was disgusting and sexist. And the main concern from the board was the it's going to cost us money to not have scantily clad women dancing. So it's there. I'm sure it will be there in that chapter, looking particularly at football. It's no coincidence that at the same time we try to create the most stable rigid form of masculinity, we're doing the same with feminine.
It's also interesting to see what's happening with female commentators too.
Well, isn't this fascinating? If you remember 2 o'clock Saturday football, Debbie Splain,
Yes.
the only female commentator, somewhat semi-butch kind of woman in the mid-90s, my hero, and now they're finally on the commercial television shows seeing female commentators, and they're all beautiful.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
There's no place for an
It seems to have become a thing that you have to have a female
Yeah, and
news
it's
anchor.
but people think it's the same in America now, but they're always beautiful.
Yeah.
There's no and they're young. There's no
Yeah.
place for a middle-aged Debbie Splain anymore.
If you look at
So that should
ESPN,
give you perspective.
if you look at ESPN and its program Soccer Net,
Yeah.
it has a female co-anchor often, and she is black, she is big, she was no way fit that ideal model of
And
what
this would be very unusual, and this was my point about liturgy, about gender inclusion. Usually when we start including women, we construct this very narrow view of what kind of woman we're including. So we'll get female commentators in, but where you have someone like Debbie Splain doing this weird, unusual, queer thing in the 90s, suddenly, it's got to be a young, attractive
It's
thin woman.
interesting, someone's done research about how apparently there was a woman artist in the late 1800s in London, and in her 20s she did a painting that got was allowed into the Royal College, and she was the first woman to have ever been allowed. And when at the time they thought she was going to do it, there was all these news articles and stuff about how the society was changing and she was going to be allowed into this Royal College, and you know they were all saying how wonderful she was, and she just vanished. She was never shown in the college again. They tried to appoint her to the board at one, like straight after, but that failed, and then never tried again. And the research was about how there's like an attempt to let women in, and then it fails, and it's almost like we've ticked that box. We've had a woman show, so we're good now, and it gives them permission to retreat away from that for the next however many years before you need to do it again.
Because it's not quite as uncommon as you think, because also in Formula One, Natalie
Yeah.
Pinkman is also, she's not,
Well,
while she is white,
They compared this woman artist to Julia Gillard then, about how, you know, we think we're ready for a woman to be the Prime Minister or whatever, but, you know, look what happened, and she's been killed for it.
Yeah, that's right. What we really meant was we were ready for Quentin Bryce or something.
Yeah.
Not Julia, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
one of the most respected Prime Ministers of England is Maggie Thatcher.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Once we see Thatcher, I'm going to have to call it time. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Janice, for speaking to us today. I think we should start a petition to get Janice on Q&A. I think they go up against some of the commentators, and I would be wanting to be in that audience. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Our next Lunchbox seminar is on Monday the 17th of October, and we have Carolyn Kitto coming from Stop the Traffic, and she's bringing chocolate for us to taste, so please feel welcome to join us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.